Welcome to the Dr. Dad's podcast, where a naturopath and chiropractor come together each week to share lifestyle medicine, health advice, and inspiring interviews with some of the top experts in health and wellness, bringing you the latest in nutrition, exercise, ancient healing, toxins and detox, your microbiome, mindset, hormones, brain, and much more. Stay tuned, we're going to teach you how to experience growth daily.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Dr. Dad's podcast. Dr. David Wardy, how are you?
How are you, brother? I'm amazing today.
You're always amazing.
Buddy, we're in better times. We're in better times.
It's true.
Yeah.
True. And better times also a mindset, right?
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
Especially right now.
Yes. So we've got lots of cool stuff that we're going to talk about today, but we have a very special guest on the show with us today. His name is Dr. Jason Hughes. He's a mentor to me, a friend to me. He's now a friend of Dr. David's here. He's been in practice for nearly 2 decades. He's one of the smartest men I know. He has an incredible capacity to nuance conversations so that they make sense on so many different levels. We are in the midst of just chaos in the realm of understanding what's real, what's not. And we're going to have a really in-depth conversation around all the things that we're being told by mainstream media in response to crisis, in response to immune health, and all sorts of other things. So it's going to be a great conversation. So Dr. Jason Hughes, thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today?
Well, pretty good. Thank you very much as well. I have to say that I think I feel right at home because I'm a doctor as well as a dad.
Yes. Welcome to the tribe.
Exactly.
Funny, when we first launched our podcast, we were thinking, okay, we're just going to get dads on the show, and then, but it's always fun. Obviously, we haven't just done that, but it's always fun when there is actually another Dr. Dad on the Dr. Dad show. So yeah, I'm happy you pointed that out.
Exactly. Well, it lends an interesting perspective. I mean, it's like we're trying to navigate this situation as doctors, and we're also trying to navigate it as family people, and I think that both of those kind of lenses are really important, kind of moving forward in our world right now.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's jump right into that because that's one of the conversations we want to have with you. We had Dr. Jason Hughes on our other podcast, The Health Ignited, with Sonia and myself. So tune into that one if you can too, because it gets into some of the conversation around courage and belief system and understanding this role of certainty and uncertainty in uncertain times. But I want to take this conversation a little bit deeper. That could be considered part 1, and this could be part 2, where we get into a little bit more of a discussion around where do we sit with this information? If you were to say, just help someone understand a bigger picture of the crisis that seemingly we're under. We were on the conversation just before the call where my life feels kind of normal, and then you go to social media and it's like there's still chaos happening, and then there's always seems to be something new surfacing. How is someone supposed to enter into maybe a more nuanced discussion or conversation of the world that we're in? I know that's a very big question, but I'm sure you can take some of that and run with it.
Okay.
You told me you were good, buddy, but that was a big question.
So I'll give my 2 cents as a way to kind of start the conversation off. So, the first thing that I would say is that we live in a time where, if it's not evident to everyone now, it should be that we're at a war of perspectives. And, I think one of the things that's happening kind of on a very obvious level now is that not everybody has the same views about how the world's supposed to be and how that kind of manifests in all sorts of different kind of areas of life. And so I think one of the most important skills is the ability to kind of, listen to different perspectives and kind of weigh different perspectives. There's this great word, it's called dialectic. And dialectic is different from debate, because with a debate, you're trying to kind of make your point the main point and convince people. But a dialectic is kind of like an open kind of a community of like perspectives that kind of come together, and that the idea behind a dialectic is that each one in that community of perspectives is kind of holding the value of trying to find truth as the primary value. And I hope this kind of conversation can be a dialectic rather than like me just spouting off my own opinion, because I think we all have important perspectives to kind of put in the middle and play around with, if that makes sense to you. Mm-hmm. So I think in our previous conversation we talked about this idea of like how there's all these different perspectives out there, and like we can hold them with an open hand rather than a closed hand. Because, I think one of the things that's happening in our world right now is that people are contracting around their own perspectives and not allowing other perspectives in order to kind of guide themselves, guide their own kind of worldviews, and guide our society and our world as a whole. So I'm open to hearing your guys' perspectives on any conversation topics we got going on. But yeah, that's my hope and my intention moving forward, that we can kind of model this idea of a dialectic and kind of hold that value of like coming to truth as the kind of higher order bit, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I love that you started there, because with enough time having gone by, I think most of us, or many of us, are more in this mindset of like, I guess there's more to this that I didn't realize before. And so I think there is an evolution in the understanding of this global crisis that we're in, where people are starting to question things more. And so I think there's more of an offering towards that, which is great. So on that note, I think a good tactile or pragmatic thing to look at, let's just talk about masks for a moment. And I think masks have, there's a logistical aspect to masks, but then there's also a paradigm to wearing a mask and what that means. So I mean, there's many different directions we go, but let's just talk about what is the role of a mask. And David or Jason, obviously we want everybody's dialectic conversation on this, but let's start there, Jason.
This could quickly get very broad in its kind of scope, if you understand what I'm talking about, because I think we could kind of have several streams of thinking happening simultaneously right off the bat. So, the scientific kind of perspective would be, the idea of masks inhibiting transmission of disease, right? And I think we could have a kind of an in-depth conversation around the science of that, whether that's a valid thing or a not valid thing. And I think the science is mixed at best, to tell you the truth. But the reality situation is, I think that there's other variables at play when we talk about the idea of masks. We're talking also about like almost like a political compliance issue. And so, and further than that, we almost have like a kind of like a projection of your own ideology. Like, you understand what I'm talking about? So this is a multi-layered conversation that we're having simultaneously, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of stuff happening. I heard this story. My mom, my stepmother, is a practitioner, and we have conversations about these types of things all the time. And she was in the grocery store not too long ago, and she was just aghast because somebody wearing a mask was just verbally abusing somebody that was not wearing a mask. And I think it speaks to this idea of all these different things happening simultaneously. Yes, we could have a conversation about the kind of scientific validity of, what is the evidence say around wearing a mask versus not wearing a mask. But, I think the thing that really hits, where the rubber meets the road in terms of our daily life is all the other variables, like, the political identification and like, are you belonging to my particular ideology and all this other kind of crap, excuse my French, but, but, I think the surface level conversation is like, oh no, this is the scientific kind of thing to do. But the reality situations, we're speaking about other variables at play. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. So David, I mean, you're in a state right now. There's just done some mandates around, or maybe in your county. Talk about that a little bit, because that's taking a scientific model to make an explanation for something and turning into a policy on some level.
Yeah, I'm listening to Dr. Jason right now, and buddy, you definitely thickened the conversation here. And you're absolutely right, man. It goes beyond, right, just that surface layer of it. So now it's affecting me because as a business owner, and honestly, like where I'm at on this is Texas has been a pretty open state as of now. I mean, we're considered one of the free states, they're calling it right now, as with this stuff's opening back up. And many of the people that are out and about, they're not wearing masks. Some of the stores around here mandate it, so you can't enter the store without it on, and then some stores don't care. And then just this week, they mandated in El Paso, the city did. The governor basically gave each city the right to mandate what they wanted to do. So El Paso passed a mandate for business owners that they had to basically wear masks or there would be an $800 fine. So, man, I don't take stuff like this lightly, especially because where I'm at with this, like you're saying, the science is mixed. And, my customers come in and they don't want to wear masks, and they feel more comfortable if I'm not wearing a mask. But now I'm being mandated to go basically against my beliefs on this whole bit. And I honestly, like you're saying, I feel like I'm being controlled and my rights are being taken away from me. And that's just where I'm at with it. Like you're saying, let's just open the conversation. I feel like my right with my beliefs where I'm at on this and everything, and honestly, the way my business is and just the whole bit of it is like, okay, no, now there's a piece of control coming in by the government and saying, no, you have to do this.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think this topic is like a microcosm of what's going on in the macrocosm. And one of the ways we could kind of think about this is that I think what we're seeing in our world, and it's manifesting in all sorts of different areas, is just a hell of a lot more authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. And I'm really concerned about that, and I think that it has implications with respect to how we practice medicine right now, but also how we're going to practice medicine in the future. And I've been thinking about all the protests and riots, and some aspects of it I'm wholeheartedly on board with, and other aspects I'm very cautious of. So I think it's another manifestation of like this kind of thing that we're seeing in the field of medicine right now. And I've been thinking about it a lot. And there's this one thinker that I really appreciate. His name is Jordan Hall. He's actually from Texas. Mm-hmm. And he talked about this idea of like corruption. And I really think that is, one of the benefits of the whole protest movement that's happening right now is it's pointing out corruption. And I can wholeheartedly get on board with that notion, but I think their scope of, what they want to change is so limited. Like I totally get the idea of like wanting to change this idea of like the militarization of the police, but I think corruption is just rampant in so much right now. And like, we really need to be able to kind of take a step back and see that there's corruption everywhere. So, for example, just off the top of my head, medicine, there's a ton of corruption in medicine. There's a ton of corruption in science. There's a ton of corruption in policy and how policy gets set. There's a ton of corruption on, like, for example, just how research is done and what is published. There's a ton of corruption in media, right? So I think the common denominator that we're seeing in all these different avenues is this kind of a sense of corruption, right? Now it manifests in medicine, right? It manifests in the science that we can read in journals. It also manifests in like what policies come down from higher ups in terms of masks, as well as, hey, maybe you're a profession that can see people through a pandemic, and maybe you're not, right? So, you know, I don't have any answers for these, but I can start to identify these. Like, I mean, that's what I've been trained to like diagnose, right? I've been trained to diagnose, and I'm trained to look in the pattern that connects, and that's the thing that I'm really kind of, I think, skillful at, is looking for that pattern that kind of connects, if that makes sense to you guys. Mm-hmm. And I think the pattern that connects right now is just, we are dealing with a hell of a lot of corruption in a whole bunch of our kind of structures of our society. And what does that mean for us as docs? Like, you know, how do we navigate the situation right now? Like, I mean, I can get on my high horse here and kind of talk about this for a long time, but how do we navigate? For example, Nick and I are in BC, right? Right now in BC, we are going through a process of our regulatory body is changing dramatically. And we're in a situation where, we have little to no control over the changes that are happening to our regulatory body, but that's going to affect the way that we can practice and run our business considerably. And it's kind of this big unknown, right? So this idea of like authoritarian stuff and this kind of corruption manifesting in a whole bunch of different ways. So maybe I'll pass it back to you guys and see if I didn't kind of like go off on a rail there. No, that makes sense to you guys?
It totally does. Well, I like that you labeled that, because there's always an undercurrent to a lot of things. I mean, when we look at these things that are being mandated, the other one being, the vaccine potentially could be something that's being mandated. Bill 11 in New Brunswick, they tried to push that forward. That would have made it would remove the religious exemptions, non-medical exemptions, and it was actually even trying to disrupt our form of constitution that would bypass just our rights. And to look at that on one level, you can say, well, this person believes, or the person that was trying to promote this believes so deeply in this one thing that it works for absolutely everybody, to the point that it's going to disrupt the founding instruction for what's these rules and regulations that we follow just to be Canadian citizens. And for one mandate to have that much disruption, obviously it got shut down, thank goodness. But I mean, you can't help but think like there's one agenda to look at on the superficial level, but there are deeper levels to how things are being presented. Even to think of, you're going to tell me how I have to operate inside my business. And David, I'm using your example. I have to wear a mask, even though there's mixed science, even though the effect of just being able to communicate with someone is going to be hindered because they're not going to be able to see my facial expressions. Totally. I'm not going to be able to make that same connection I usually do to have the kind of impact that I can have with this individual. I mean, there's so many different ways to look at this as a patient doctor, and we, in that human contact, even whether it's through Zoom or in person, there's something that needs to happen in order for a patient to move into trust with the person they're working with. And so, I think of like, well, me wearing a mask is actually going to deteriorate the quality of connection, the quality of potentially treatment, the quality of getting the right kind of feedback from the person that you're trying to work with. You can tell when someone's sort of smiling with their eyes, but there's so much to, this conversation. And
totally,
I'm glad you rounded it out for us to be able to talk about.
There's that great, I know you're aware of this, Nick, but there's that great kind of metaphor in Chinese medicine of like root and branch. And, the idea of like, is this the kind of symptomatic expression, or is this the kind of root cause of things? So I think that the whole idea of the mask is like a branch, right? And so like this underlying kind of creeping authoritarianism, and and it's multifaceted, and like even like when we talk about this idea of like media, and David, I know this is happening in the States as well, right? But like up here in Canada, the CBC is just like, it's tremendously biased against natural medicine. And so, the question for me is like, yes, we have this issue of masks, right? And, how do we kind of navigate this issue of masks? But I think it's important to understand that I think it needs to be couched in a much larger understanding of like, how do we start to kind of navigate this whole idea of creeping authoritarianism in not only masks, but like, this idea of our regulatory body changing, or these like mandates coming down the pike, or this idea of like media skewing things to kind of, their investors' interests and so on and so forth. So that's where my mind kind of goes to this idea of like this creeping authoritarianism and the corruption of many different institutions. And I don't have a perfect answer for how to navigate that, but I can start to see the bigger picture now.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's, sorry, Dave, just to validate what you're saying. I think that's the thing that we all have to come to. We all have to come to that. Oh, I see more about what's going on, right? It's not just that we're waking up. We're just realizing that, the problems with our immune health has been here way before this virus. And it goes back to corruption. We are stuck in an old paradigm of a germ theory that's ruling all of our, all the mandates, all the conventional, public health type dialogue. So just to your point, like it's really time to start to see a bigger picture, and we have to look at part of that corruption. So go ahead, David, you're going to say something.
Well, no, you guys are painting such a clear picture of the reality of what's happening, and I'm listening to you, and it's no different in the U.S., man. Like we have the same problems you guys have,
right.
and I like you guys said something earlier, like the reality of what we're living, and then they're two different things. Like I feel like I'm living in two different worlds. But I don't know. I don't really know how many people are honestly seeing the big picture. Like we're talking, you you look at some of the population, right? There's going to be a good chunk where they're still like, it's like the sheep. They're herding sheep. Like they just trust. There's just absolute trust in whatever they're told by governmental bodies. They don't question anything. And so that's what you're saying. There's so much contrast in all these different pieces. But it's affecting us on so many different levels because of that. And like you're saying, it's like, what did you say earlier? We're in a time of like, everyone's got their idea of what this is supposed to look like. Right. So, and that's why this idea of like dialectic really is really important, because like, I think if we can, I'll speak as a natural health kind of profession, groups of profession. We can kind of understand these bigger picture influences that are kind of producing pushback to, the way we've been working for a long time. We might be able to kind of confront them a little bit better. So rather than just speaking of this idea of like, I don't want to wear a damn mask, it's going to get in the way of me like seeing my patients and the comfort level and how they're open there with me and all this other kind of stuff. Like, yeah, that's all fine and good. But if we're not paying attention to the bigger picture, then, well, in Canada, like the CBC's got a big microphone. Mm-hmm. And we might be able to kind of not wear masks with people, but the CBC is like talking to people like we're, crazy folks trying to do natural medicine on people, then that's going to continually erode. So how do we kind of for lack of a better word, how do we organize for more than just these small things, but really organize so that we can kind of be a united voice, kind of as a way to keep our freedoms, dude. Mm-hmm. As totally. A way to keep our health freedoms. I mean, this is really important stuff. Everybody's got kids here, yeah. Right? Do we want people with questionable science and questionable values that we may not line up with, kind of dictating and mandating the health of our children and what kind of interventions our children are kind of mandated to have? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is challenging, and you know what? There's a problem with complacency and convenience. This is a reality of the food industry. we've given up, healthier soil for, maybe potentially increased production with, the different pesticides and things that are used on crops and trying to, mass produce things, which we now realize that actually that doesn't work. How many different experiments do we have to go through to realize that this isn't working? We're trying to adopt our modern lifestyle and culture and medicine in with old paradigms, and it's like a square peg in a round hole kind of phenomenon. And as we move forward collectively, as parents, as practitioners, as doctors, as just citizens, we at some point and I think it has to happen from the ground up, we have to, from the ground up, realize that things are not working. We have to do things differently, but there has to be a massive amount of education around that. So, what do you guys think about, when there's such, a dichotomy to these conversations, and we've given up a lot of our rights or knowledge or whatever towards complacency and convenience. We've just kind of bypassed any sort of investigative process on our end because we just believe that everything we're being told is truth. How do we move forward with this kind of dichotomy?
Well, I could say a few words about that. I've been in practice for a long time, and it keeps me busy, right? So it's difficult to juggle all these balls, right? And but I think one of the things that I'm realizing is that that's no longer gonna fly. Like I gotta put more hats on and be an advocate for my own kind of viewpoints as well. I read a really interesting book recently. I have this tendency when I kind of come into some sort of resistance or like have some sort of pushback, I research. And so I read this really interesting book recently. It's called How to Have Impossible Conversations. And it was a really great book. And this idea of, dialectic is one of the things that I think that kind of was one of the take-home points from that book. And, I think we're at this really interesting time right now where there's, everything's, at play. Like we can make all sorts of different changes right now that are going to allow us to kind of course correct for the future. And I think this is the opportunity of the time we have right now, is to really, if we have the capacity to like kind of recognize where we are, we might be able to kind of have our voices heard, ideally, so that we can kind of chart a course forward. For example, could you imagine if you remember the Flexner report, Nick?
Yeah,
Flexner,
I do.
Yeah. Right. So just a little bit of history, right? Like we have in naturopathic medicine, we learned about this thing called the Flexner report. The Flexner report was commissioned by, I believe it was, don't quote me on this, but one of the big barons in the 20s or 30s. It was the Scottish guy. Can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, one of the billionaires from like the 1920s and 30s, and he was firmly behind the whole idea of pharmaceutical medicine kind of taking root. So he commissioned this report called the Flexner report and submitted it to the governing bodies of the U.S. And it was highly, highly influential in like setting policies moving forward. And what it meant was that all these natural medicine schools, they went from a huge number down to a very small number very, very quickly. Now, could you imagine if we had some sort of consensus voice of like natural medicine practitioners in the 1920s and 30s kind of standing up and saying, hey, wait a minute, and being skillful at navigating conversations with people that might have had differing views? We might have saved decades and decades of like regression of our field because we were able to kind of sit with somebody with a different perspective and say, all right, well, that's your point, but this is my point. Maybe we can come to sort of kind of consensus truth here.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
And I think we're in one of those periods of time right now but it's happening in all these different ways, like all these different avenues of life right now. It's truly remarkable times, and I think what I've been focusing on is really learning, because it is, it's new for me as well, learning how to kind of have these dialectic conversations with people with opposing views, so that we might be able to kind of stand up for what we believe in, without feeling to shrink back and just like, all right, well, this is what's going to happen to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that you're saying that, because that's where the commonality can come, right? Because when we have these opposing opinions, that basically, we recognize an opposing opinion as a threat, and then we position ourselves here. That I'm not going to listen to anything else that person says, because
Right.
they've opposed me on this one point. Instead, like, this is how it works from the ground up, I believe, is that, interesting, you feel that way. This is how if you're interested, I'd love for you to listen to what my perspective is. But there's common ground in every conversation. There's common ground even, with me and the person pushing policy at the head of this, the state, the province, whatever. There's common ground somewhere. But
right.
I actually don't feel like it's going to be a top-down change. I really feel like it's going to be bottom up. And so all of us collectively, those of you listening, other doctors, patients, whatever, with these conversations that we need to have, and we talked about mental toughness on one of our podcasts last week, I believe it was, just we have to be able to hold our point of view without trying to change someone's point of view, allow them the space to share what they feel, and not wrong them for that, because we're gonna lose those people immediately as soon as we try to prove them wrong. Like, for example, this conversation, we could have gone down the road of like, this science says this, and this is, but we didn't, because really what we want to do is create cohesion. We want to create a level playing field where there's common ground. At the end of the day, our common ground is none of us want corruption. Right. Everybody wants inclusivity. Everybody wants things to grow and evolve in a positive way at the end of the day. So, there's little differences in opinion, maybe on, what type of healthcare someone uses, whether or not they mask, whether, they like to shelter in place, whether or not they like to social distance or what have you. Those are just nuances. Those are the how to get through your day. But the core thing that's going to hold us all up is where we can find that community, which is, how we started this conversation.
Exactly. Could you imagine a world in which, the actual policies were defined by actual science, and the science was not corrupt, and the policy was not corrupt by, moneyed interests, and the science was not corrupted by moneyed interests. That's the ideal future that I would kind of hold. And, I think, I concur with what you're trying to talk about, but I would add, like, the ability to kind of, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was a massage therapist, and he was getting overwhelmed by his interactions on social media. And because he was trying to hold his opinion and just kind of getting, mobbed, for lack of a better word. So, I offered this kind of idea, right? Like, so this idea was like, chew but don't swallow. So the idea is like, you take in somebody else's perspective, you chew it, you taste it, but you don't have to swallow it. You can still hold your perspective, right? So it's okay to have differing perspectives, right? But I think in terms of medicine, and I think we really need to be able to kind of have a common front to be able to kind of stand up for our own perspectives on things. And I think the thing we need to be able to do is we need to have conversations like exactly what we're having right now, right? Mm-hmm. Like we can talk about the science, and they can talk about the science, and like we can go like this, and whoever has the most money with the policymakers gets to make the rules, right? But if we have this critical mass of people that we can kind of rely upon, then I think we can be more influential in the what unfolds for the future. Mm-hmm. And so I think now is a time to have like some some interesting conversations and like try to take as much perspectives in as can. And yeah, it's not about necessarily trying to convince other people, but it's just you're trying to help people go, that's a good point.
Yeah. David, hop in there, buddy.
No, I mean, it's a difficult topic, right? Like you're saying, there's just so much depth to it. As you guys are talking, I'm just thinking about the last 3 months of like all the ways that it's affected us and how the ripple effect, like I thought it was starting to trickle out, but it's kind of like there's these tremors that keep coming through.
Right.
And, you're talking about, like, I think this change is going to have to come from the bottom up. And I'm thinking, well, how much more do we need to handle and take of this authoritarian type picture being painted in front of us and our realities before we actually do something?
Right.
Like, what is it going to take? Because I know we're going to talk about it for a while.
Yeah.
But is it going to get to the point where, like, we actually have to take action now and quit talking about it? Like, where are we at there?
Right.
Because I'm thinking in my situation locally with my business, and I'm like, okay, if I needed to get a message out there, I could just like burn my mask and say, screw this, and get a fine and fight the fine and make a big deal and call the news stations and like bring home my point of it so that everybody could see it. And I could do that because people would see, like, what's this guy all about? What's he trying to say? We're refusing to do this. And then I think, okay, we could do it a political way. There could be a softer way to make these changes. But it's like, we're talking about corruption right now.
I know.
So what is it gonna take for us to get a shift here? Because, it's just a hard thing to.
It is a hard thing because, I would kind of point back to it. We're all dads, right? Like, those kind of actions have consequences, right? Like potential consequences, right? So, like this, when you ask that question, what is it going to take? Well, maybe it takes the ability to kind of actually look at the fear of not doing or of doing those types of things, right? Because like when I think about those types of things for myself, I think immediately like, well, oh crap, if I do something like that, is my ability to make an income going to be lost? Does that make sense? And so this is how things stay.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, what are we willing to do? Because people that have come before us in history, they hit a point. There was a threshold where it was like, this has to be done. Like the sacrifice of what I'm going to do to my life is going to I've got to take it because what I'm fighting for is bigger now.
Right.
And my concern with all this stuff is are we going to get there? Because I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're inching our way there.
Right.
And I feel like we need to take action before we get there. But what does that look like, especially for our professions, like you're saying?
Right. So exactly what I'm saying, right? But you don't want to have like 900 different directions with that action. You want to have like some sort of united front. Yeah. You understand what I'm saying? Because like, if it's got 900 directions, nothing's going to get done. But if we can kind of come to some commonalities and agree to some basic tenets, we might be able to stand firm and be like, hell no, I don't want my regulatory body to be just medical doctors or representatives from the pharmaceutical industry, because I don't think they have the philosophical or kind of historical background to understand how naturopathic doctors practice. You understand?
Yeah.
And so I get it. Like, I don't have the answers to these questions, but I can see some of the first steps to move in that right direction. I think some of the first steps are docs got to be able to talk to each other and have conversation about it. And by the way, man, it's not like this us them mentality, right? I know there are a ton of medical doctors out there that are just completely frustrated with the whole system as it stands right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know that for an absolute fact. So it's not just us. I think there's there's frustration enough to go around at this point, right? That makes sense?
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of that commonality too, is, you know, there's the opportunity in frustration. There's an opportunity in, you know, challenge that allows us to realize that, you know, things don't smell right. You know, things are not going in alignment with a true, like what we see to be a true healthcare version of this, like a health approach. You know, if you start asking the question, like corruption, and then what does corruption segue into on a global messaging point of view? Well, it's censorship. It's this lack of sharing vital information. So if we just, you know, dropped into some basic statistics, you know, whatever it is that's affecting the globe in this point in time. The reason I say whatever it is affecting, because people are dying with a virus. They're not necessarily dying of a virus. There's all these comorbidities. There's all these, you know, situations happening in people's lives and in their own health that have made them more susceptible to chronic, or it's an acute, very exacerbated inflammatory mechanism. And then we've now realized in this corruption, there's been a poor way of disseminating information and how to treat these people in these end stage situations, right? With ventilation and, you know, as high as 80% mortality. So we're basing entire decisions on how we should be thinking of things by looking at math, not looking at science and health. So if we took a step back and looked, okay, well, there's some core tenets into having a healthy body. You know, we put real food in to rebuild a real body. You know, we decrease, like, why isn't there could be a mass, I mean, that's top down strategy, but there could be a mass amount of communication on what it means to live a healthy life, you know, or even the bare minimum, you know, vitamin D and some of those things that are coming out with more research showing the decreased morbidity and some of the cytokine issues or the inflammatory issues are showing up. So, you know, there's this massive contrast where we've got information and then we've got expectation of all of us health professionals sharing the message from that top-down perspective, despite there being a huge amount of censorship around what people are actually being affected by certain things. And when we hold that for ourselves, and we hold that as doctors, knowing, I mean, you've been in practice for 2 decades. Combined, Dave and I have been in practice for 2 decades. We've seen a lot of people massively transform their health in the ways that we teach. We've seen people with chronic illness turn that around in such a profound way. We've got stories, they're in hundreds or if not thousands between us, you know, and with thousands individually, and then between us, you know, tens of thousands potentially of people making massive changes. And yet the entire scenario is around the one thing being, you know, this virus that we're in. But in order for a virus to cause the kind of disturbance that it's causing the mass amount of people, it's all the other things. It's the 900 other things that have led to this moment. But our microscope is on the one thing. And so, and I think that's where a lot of us are getting lost in the censorship and buying into the fear that's been propagated through, you know, movies and other things that have, you know, made us afraid of these things. I mean, I was listening to stats earlier today. You know, 1 in 2 people are diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah.
I mean, like, what about that statistic? You know, the cardiovascular disease rates. I mean, the amount of control that people, if they only realized that they had, it would be a game changer. And yet there's so much stopping of information, you know.
Right.
So
anyways, you know, I wholeheartedly agree. I think you're preaching to the choir there, you know. In our previous conversation, we went into more detail around, like, you know, the difference between terrain and germ theory and whatnot. And, you know, I think an obvious example is, you know, how much in, you know, the mainstream press, how much is the mainstream press even talked about this idea of supporting immune system function through this? It's like, at anything, it's just like this aside as an afterthought. You know, the immediate kind of focus of, like, all of our media, which I believe is a form of censorship is, like, oh, we got to wait for the vaccine, right? And, regardless of whether a good vaccine has ever been made for a coronavirus before, I mean, that's the immediate kind of bias, if you understand what I'm talking about, right? So, but, regardless of all the science that suggests that vitamin D is going to reduce severity and kind of potentially be prophylactic, and vitamin C is amazing for, all this stuff. I mean, we have a lot of kind of evidence coming before, but, that does not get covered. So, when it goes back to that kind of, what can we do question, I think we can have conversations like this, and we can start to kind of strategize, how we can get our word out in a culture that is, against us, for lack of a better way of talking about it. So,
yeah. I feel like there's been a shift, though. I feel like there has been a little bit of a shift in the past decade for natural health. I feel like some more people are leaning because they've been failed with chronic disease, for example, with this acute model, right? So enough people are going through having a problem, not getting the solutions, and shifting and then getting a solution to where the tide is shifting a little bit. But I feel like, you look at something like that's what's happening right now, it's like a big uppercut to the jaw to our profession. Because it's like we were getting momentum.
I know.
And it's like, oh, okay. And then boom, let me just put them down real quick a little bit. But then at the same time, it's like you're saying, it's being exposed as like, okay, well, why are you getting sick from having these problems? Well, you didn't take care of yourself. Why? Oh, well, here's all the basic things. Well, who gives those and gives that advice? Oh, you say.
Exactly.
So you start following it back. And it's like, even though you're trying to do this, people that have half a brain still are going to figure it out, over time. And I think, it's unfortunate just to say we have time on our side, but in all honesty, I think the cog will still be spinning in our favor, but it's going to be a little harder to push it right now.
I agree. There's this great quote that I love. Things are getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster.
Yes.
So true.
So, we have all of these kind of influences happening simultaneously. And I would expect that your guys' experience is very similar to mine, in the sense that, we're not successful because, all of these kind of standard systems of society are kind of pushing people towards us. We're successful because people come to us and they get better, and then they start talking to other people, right? So really, our professions traditionally have really survived because of word of mouth, and the fact that people are not being served by other strategies. And I wholeheartly agree with that kind of idea. But and you're right. I think I often tell people, like, when I first started practice, however long ago it was, I remember I had to teach people so much more. I had to teach people, like, oh, well, this is because of what's going on in your gastrointestinal tract, and we need to talk about your gut. But nowadays they come in and they're like, well, I want to do this, this, and this because I looked on Google about what's causing it. And so, it's a much different conversations now. So, better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because I do also feel that with the patients that come in. Even it's fascinating, just the flow of information and how it transcends someone's educational level and their ability to adapt and learn information, and acquire and want better for themselves. It's fascinating. And so it's actually it's gotten more, I don't know what you guys, but it's gotten more fun in practice, being able to take people into a deeper level of health as a result of them choosing more education, because that's essentially what it is. We have to want better for ourselves. And I think with, in this conversation we're having, as more people do want better for themselves, for their children, for the world around us, we're going to be able to, again, take things deeper, and I imagine, in this future model of the world that we're in, we're enough of this groundswell of us, at the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, that are literally holding the pyramid together. Obviously, that's the foundation, right? This groundswell of us just going, you know what? No, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to listen to my own body because I've done my thorough education, and I do imagine a world, and maybe I'm being super idealistic, but I do imagine a world where enough of us do, rise and take responsibility, because as we've learned in this experience, the more reliant, and we talked about this in the other conversation, the more reliant we are on something outside of us, the less autonomy we have, the less chance of survival we have when we're constantly giving our power away, giving, our opportunities away. I love having conversations on a regular basis with patients who come in and tell me like how they've transformed their business or how they've transformed their family life at home. And we talked about this before we got on the call. It's like the people that I interact with one-on-one or like in a physical sense, not that I see from a distance, are manufacturing new ways of looking at things and maybe have come to new realizations about the world that we're in. And yet, despite, what we're being told in mainstream media, it sounds like there's still an old conversation. And so you can see that this old conversation is perpetual in medicine, in politics, in whatever. It's
media.
So old. Yeah, in media in general. And yet everyone else is moving forward. And so what if we all realize that we're all moving forward?
Right. So I totally agree with that. And I think I love that you use the word autonomy, right? Mm-hmm. Because like, I think one of the things we're seeing is like, you're right, there is movement right now. But I think this idea of like where we move is really important, because are we going to move towards more kind of authoritarianism, or are we going to move towards more autonomy, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important conversation. I think, there's this other quote that I love. It goes like this: there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. Mm. And it kind of points to this idea that there are these like major inflection points in history. And I don't think I need to convince you guys that we are at a major inflection point in the history of, our world right now. Yeah. And so I think the, what can we do? I think the first thing we can do is we can have these really important conversations, these dialectics, to see if we can kind of decipher some truth. And this conversation is a perfect example of that, right? And then ideally what we might be able to do is just kind of get some sort of consensus, so that we might be able to kind of, be a little bit more of a united front. I know, like, traditionally, like, all of us natural medicine practitioners are lone wolves, or at least I can speak to myself, but we do our thing, and we're not a huge lobby, if you understand what I'm talking about. But if we might be able to kind of have a little bit more consensus between us, or at least between like-minded individuals, we could kind of stand up to some of the things that are kind of giving us the short shrift, and be like, hey, wait a minute, no, there's real reason and logic behind some of the strategies we're using with people, so that we might be able to kind of point that direction of the tanker moving forward in a direction where we're not going to be run over, but we're going to be included. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I love this conversation is hopefully encouraging people to hold different perspectives, to see that there's more to a picture, and that having nuanced conversations is super important, and it's really how we can create connectivity. Because, like you said, when someone's sharing something, you can choose to chew on it, but you don't have to swallow it. I love that. That's a beautiful description of how we can just relate to one another, because it's a verb, it's a process of relationship. Yes. Right? It's an action. It's not a static thing. Like, David and I have transformed how we've done our podcast over time. Like, it's not a static, one-dimensional experience. Neither is it with anything that's in life, even us as practitioners. I mean, that changes all the time. And I think part of our challenge is that it's okay to change. It's okay to adapt. It's okay to see old information that once upon a time made sense, but it doesn't really make sense anymore. It's okay. I was wrong. That part of that conversation wasn't accurate or quite right. And now I've been able to adjust. And what we're speaking about is adaptability, our ability to adapt to our environment, right? I mean, that's essentially what I love the applause for my mentor. The Darwinian approach is to realize it's not the survival of the fittest, but it's those that are most able to adapt to the environment. So do we adapt in a controlling authoritative model, or do we adapt through autonomy?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, those are definitely directions that are on the table right now.
Yeah.
And I think if we can be clear, and if we can have these types of conversations, we can nudge the arrow of history in the direction towards what lines up most with our values. Right? So, this is an ongoing conversation, guys. I really, I think it's important to have, and I wish we had a magic wand where we could just change everything. I don't think that's gonna happen. But I think now is the time for big ideas like this. Now is the time for really kind of hashing out these kind of bigger picture things. It's interesting that we got here by just talking about masks, right? But it's like we can use our training to look at what is the symptom kind of pointing to in terms of the underlying cause, to really start to have some of these deeper conversations. And
beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, Jason, with every call we do, we always get people to implement some sort of home play, something to, either it's time invested in something, or maybe it could be a thought exercise. What would you suggest for the listeners tuning into this podcast, the different dialectic conversations we've had? What would be something you'd recommend for people to either, maybe it could be something they could read or practice for themselves?
I think we'd go back to that idea of chewing and not swallowing, and the idea of we all hold our own views, right? And I think it's really important to expose ourselves to other points of view, and you don't need to adapt that point of view. It's just a matter of entertaining it. This idea of taking that view in enough that you can actually understand it. You may find that it kind of alters your perspective just a little bit, right? And that's this idea of having nuance, right? This idea of being open to be adaptable to new information. I think it's so important. And I see what's going on in our world right now, and it's so needed. It's so needed right now. And so the idea of just being a little bit more kind of open to uncertainty, and a little bit more open to this idea of maybe I don't know it all. I have my views, but I'm willing to listen to somebody else.
Love it.
Well said, man.
So good. So Jason, you practice in Maple Ridge, which is sort of a suburb of Vancouver Lower Mainland. You focus on pain, hormones, gut health.
Yep.
To anything else that people need to know about you and your practice? Obviously, he's a Yoda, so if you go see him, your mind will be blown.
I have a whole bunch of Yodas on my shelf in the back.
Oh, of course you do. You walk the path. Absolutely.
So I tell people I treat pain and suffering. And so, I am a full spectrum naturopathic doc, but I have a special focus for, pain. I do a lot of regenerative pain medicines, prolotherapy, neuroprolotherapy, neural therapy, a whole bunch of regenerative pain medicines. I do a lot of work with chronic disease, gut health, so on and so forth. But I also do a lot of work with helping people with perspectives and kind of working with stress in their life and just trying to help people kind of look at life in a way that allows them to kind of navigate it with a little bit more groundedness and sanity.
Awesome. And you're taking this great philosophical mind, this Jedi mind, and you're about to create your own podcast, which we can't wait for.
I'm trying to kind of become more kind of public, and I think that's been a silver lining of this whole coronavirus thing, is that like the idea of like getting out there a little bit more. So yes, I'm in the process of collecting all my needed utensils of podcastery and kind of putting something out there. So who knows? Maybe I'll invite you guys in the near future.
No, it sounds good. Look forward to it, buddy. Thank you so much for being on the call today. Always
Likewise.
A wealth of information. Yeah.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please be sure to subscribe to the Dr. Dads and share with your family and friends. You can also follow and interact with Dr. Nick and Dr. David on Facebook and Instagram for a daily dose of inspiration and the latest in health and wellness. Be well.